At first, there is nothing. Then, a flash. A blinding white light that erases the world. No shadows, no contours, only emptiness. And then, silence. Far too long. Unnatural, unsettling. This wasn't CGI. No digital post-production, no computer effects. This was real. Christopher Nolan refused to digitally simulate the nuclear explosion in Oppenheimer. No green screens, no visual effects, no easy way out. But why? Why recreate an explosion of this scale practically when any other director would just use a computer? CGI is perfect, but a nuclear explosion isn't. It's chaotic, erratic, unpredictable, a scientific nightmare that cannot be directed. And Nolan knew if the audience didn't feel that, the scene wouldn't work. So he gave his team an almost impossible task: recreate the birth of the atomic age without CGI. What followed was a technical experiment of unprecedented scale. How do you film something that doesn't just destroy, but seems to break reality itself? This is how Christopher Nolan created the most realistic explosion in film history. Christopher Nolan had a problem that any other director would solve with a single click. A nuclear explosion in a film? CGI. For years, Hollywood has used digital fireballs, simulated shockwaves, and perfectly animated plumes of smoke. But that was precisely the problem. A nuclear bomb isn't a blockbuster explosion. It's not a symmetrical fireball expanding neatly, not a timed shockwave arriving at the perfect moment, not a carefully animated smoke column slowly dissolving into the sky. A nuclear bomb is chaos. The smoke plumes twist like monstrous tentacles. The firestorm folds in on itself. The air pulses as if the atmosphere is tearing apart. Nothing about it is predictable, but that's exactly what CGI lacks: unpredictability. Even the best digital effects feel directed. The smoke moves too perfectly. The flames spread too evenly. The shockwave lacks impact. But a nuclear explosion isn't a visual effect. It's a force of nature that doesn't fit neatly into a simulation. Nolan knew if the audience, even for a fraction of a second, got the feeling that the explosion was fake, the scene would lose its power. So there was only one solution.
Let's try and do this with no CG.
That might have sounded simple, but it immediately created a new problem. How do you recreate an explosion that defies the laws of nature? A normal explosion starts with fire. A nuclear bomb starts with light. A standard fireball grows in a controlled manner. A nuclear explosion mutates, folds in on itself, moves unpredictably. A regular shockwave is immediate. With a nuclear explosion, first comes silence, and only then the blast. It had to be massive. It had to be chaotic. It had to be the most realistic explosion in film history. But without CGI, without nuclear energy, Nolan's team had to do the impossible. They had to make fire move like a living creature. They had to create a shockwave you could feel without anything being destroyed. They had to generate a flash as blinding as the sun. And the way they did it was even crazier than the challenge itself. A nuclear bomb doesn't start with fire. It starts with light. A flash so intense it tears the sky apart, burns shadows into concrete, and for a fraction of a second, rewrites the world. Nolan knew no existing film technique could replicate that effect. So he gave his team an almost impossible task: create a flash so intense that both actors and audience would physically feel it, without any digital post-production. Their solution? Magnesium explosions. Magnesium burns at 5,600 degrees and produces a white light so blinding it overwhelms everything. The flash in Oppenheimer wasn't a visual effect. What the camera captured is exactly what the actors saw. No warning, no preparation. Their instinctive reactions, turning away, blinking, are 100% real. But an explosion isn't just light. A nuclear bomb grows, mutates, folds in on itself, and spews smoke in unpredictable directions. No standard explosion could replicate that effect. So Nolan's team developed a series of chemically layered explosions. Gasoline and aluminum powder created a wild, chaotic firestorm. Explosive charges at varying heights made the fireball mutate. IMAX cameras with variable frame rates made the flames move in an eerie, unpredictable way. The result? No digital fireballs, no simulated smoke plumes, just pure, untamed fire. But a nuclear explosion isn't complete without the shockwave. A nuclear blast displaces air faster than the speed of sound. But how do you simulate that without wiping a city off the map? The team used layered detonations to physically recreate the effect. 1. The fireball ignites. 2. A secondary air explosion triggers a visible shockwave. 3. A controlled pressure wave ripples across the set, making the actors feel the force. No green screens, no digital effects, just raw, natural power. And Nolan went even further. The audience couldn't just see the explosion, they had to feel it. So he designed the scene with absolute silence before the shockwave. The audience sits in suspense, waiting for something that refuses to come. Ultra-low frequencies in the sound mix, not a standard explosion effect, but a deep bass wave that shakes the entire theater. IMAX optimization. The fireball literally fills the screen. No CGI film could replicate this. For theatergoers, this wasn't just a scene, it was a physical experience. But the explosion was only the beginning. What came next was even more unsettling. The explosion was overwhelming. A flash that erased the world, a firestorm churning like a living creature, a shockwave tearing the air itself apart. But what Nolan truly understood was that the real impact of a nuclear bomb isn't in the explosion. It's in what happens afterward. In a real nuclear test, the fireball vanishes within seconds. But the fear? That lingers. The silence that follows is far worse than the blast. The slow realization of what just happened begins to sink in, and Nolan wanted the audience to feel that. That's why he decided that the nuclear explosion wouldn't be the loudest moment in the film. It would be the quietest. First, there is nothing but light. Then, black. For a moment, the world ceases to exist. No music, no dialogue, no background noise. Only the aftermath. The moment when those who witnessed it realized they had just crossed a line that could never be undone. Cillian Murphy's expression, his eyes wide, empty, no words, just realization. This wasn't a victory. This wasn't a technological triumph. This was the beginning of the end. But Nolan didn't stop at silence and faces. He wanted the audience to experience exactly what Oppenheimer felt. Extreme close-ups with no movement, no distractions, no quick cuts, only raw, unfiltered emotion. Subtle sound distortions, background noises fade, voices become muffled, as if the world itself is slipping away. No traditional editing. Scenes flow into each other but feel disjointed, like a nightmare where you know something is wrong, but can't escape. What theatergoers experienced wasn't just a film technique, it was existential horror. Because the true shock of the Trinity test wasn't the fire, it was the realization that this was only the beginning. The explosion was gone, the fire had died out, the shockwave had faded. But for Oppenheimer, this was the moment when everything truly began. Christopher Nolan knew that the impact of the Trinity test wasn't in the explosion itself, it was in the consequences. Not just for Oppenheimer, but for the entire world. This wasn't a spectacle, not a grand climax that the film builds up to before moving on. This was a turning point that changed everything, and he decided the audience had to feel that. So he broke away from conventional storytelling. No grand aftermath scene, no quick montage summarizing the consequences. Instead, an experience that slowly seeps into the viewer's mind, just as the bomb's aftermath did to Oppenheimer. No music, no triumphant moment, only Oppenheimer's reality falling apart. Applause distorting, cheers that grow increasingly unnatural, too loud, too chaotic, as if the voices are screaming at him rather than for him. Faces that feel wrong, people smiling, but their expressions don't match. Their movements just slightly too jerky, as if Oppenheimer can no longer tell whether he's living in a victory or a nightmare. The floor seems to tremble, not literally, but through subtle camera work. The world feels unstable, as if reality itself can no longer be trusted. And then, the most famous words in history. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But Nolan doesn't let the moment end with a dramatic declaration. He lets the words fade into silence, as if Oppenheimer can barely bring himself to say them, as if he isn't speaking to impress, but because at that moment, It's the only thought he has left. And that's when the audience realizes the real bomb never stopped exploding, because the true impact of the Trinity test wasn't the explosion. It was the realization that there was no way back. With Oppenheimer, Nolan refused to take the easy way out. No CGI, no digital illusions, only real, raw power. He didn't just show the explosion, he made the audience feel it, not as a spectacle, but as an inescapable nightmare. But this wasn't the first time he broke Hollywood's conventions. With Interstellar, he did the same. No green screens, no artificial effects, but physical sets, real gravity, and a tangible sense of space. Because cinema isn't just about showing something. It's about making you experience it, and that is the essence of Nolan's films. Whether it's the boundless vastness of space or the destructive power of mankind, his stories don't come from a computer. They are built, felt, lived, and that's why no other director makes films the way he does. Want to see how Nolan also refused to rely on CGI in Interstellar? Watch that video here.